to the University of Law podcast. In this episode, we are joined with National Programme Director, SQE, Jill Howell-Williams, and Head of SQE, Daniel Cowan, who will be discussing the routes to qualifying under the SQE and LPC. Thank you so much for joining us on the University of Law podcast, and I will now hand it over to you both.
Thank you very much. Jill and I have been working on the university's SQE courses for the past couple of years, and we will be coming to those SQE courses in just a moment. But as the LPC is still running in the background, perhaps it would be useful for us just to get a grounding in the LPC that is still running and what it is and how it works.
So thanks, Dan. Yes, we thought it'd be really helpful so that everybody listening to this podcast can understand the different options that they have available to them, for us to do a little recap about the LPC, or the legal practice course to give it its full name. So the LPC is the vocational stage of training, which is studied and passed in order to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales. So until the introduction of the SQE, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, the LPC was mandatory and students studied it following on from either completing a law degree or a postgraduate law conversion programme. So the content of the LPC and the nature of the assessments was regulated by the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and it focuses on the vocational subjects and skills required for practice as a junior lawyer or trainee. The LPC is split into two parts: Stage 1, which covers the core practice areas and skills, and Stage 2, which involves studying a number of different elective subjects where students have the choice, and this might include subjects such as commercial, employment, mergers and acquisitions, or family law. After you've completed and passed the LPC, students then progress onto a 2-year training contract, that recognised period of training, and after that is successfully completed, they can then qualify as a solicitor. So you can see it's a very prescribed formal route to qualifying as a solicitor in England and Wales.
So obviously there is a transition going on to the SQE at the moment. So who still has the option to take the LPC, and when's the cut-off?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. At the moment, the two regimes are running alongside each other in quite a long transitional period. So you can continue with the current LPC route if you're studying for a law degree, which you, in essence, completed, started, or accepted an offer of a place by September 2021. And that law degree has to have started on or before the 31st of December 2021. Now, I apologise for being so precise here, but it's very important because it does have an impact in practical terms on law students who are at different points in their law degrees. So in practical terms, all second and third year law students listening to this podcast in January 2023 can choose to study the LPC. Of course, they also have the option to use the SQE route. But I think the big point here is that for any first year law student who started their law degree last year in September 2022, that category of law student won't be eligible to take the LPC, and they will have to use the SQE route. And I should also add that if you're a non-law student, you will not be eligible to take the LPC and will have to take the SQE route as well. So we've got this situation now where we've got students who are at different points in their student journeys who will be eligible or not for the LPC. Now, the transitional arrangements are in place for quite a long time, up until the end of December 2032. Although I suspect that many providers, including the University of Law, will be unlikely to keep their LPC courses open to the end of that transitional period. But certainly the LPC is going to be important for the next few years. So, Dan, I've talked a little bit about the LPC, but obviously the other main route to qualifying now is the SQE. So perhaps you could explain a bit about the SQE route, what you have to do.
Certainly. Well, the first thing to say about the SQE is that some aspects of it will be familiar to any of you who've previously looked at the LPC route and what it contains, but there are substantial differences between the two. So, as we all know, the LPC is assessed by the traditional problem-solving written questions. You've got some multiple-choice assessments, and you've got these 5 legal skills assessments in advocacy, interviewing, writing, drafting, and legal research. Many assessments are open book, and there's no direct assessment of academic law content. So some aspects of that have been preserved and some aspects have been changed and expanded upon. So there is a similarity between the two routes, as you would expect, because they have the same end goal in mind. But the SQE, the Solicitor's Qualifying Examination, it's an independent, centralised assessment for all would-be solicitors who want to qualify in England and Wales. So there's no prescribed training course for the SQE, unlike the LPC, for these new SQE assessments. But there will be some commonality in terms of training providers and what they're offering, because there is a syllabus set out by the SRA. So under the new route, what you have to do to qualify is to have a degree. It doesn't have to be a law degree. You have to pass sets of assessments for both SQE1 and then SQE2. And it's worth saying you have to pass the SQE1 assessment before taking the SQE2 assessment. You have to undertake 2 years of what is now called qualifying work experience. So it's no longer a training contract, it's qualifying work experience, and there's a degree of flexibility been introduced into qualifying work experience as well. So the SRA has tried to make the process more flexible and make it more flexible also in terms of timing. And also something that hasn't changed at all is that you have to meet the SRA's character and suitability requirements in order to become a solicitor. So the SQE assessments, they are quite different from the LPC assessments. And something that I think we should make clear right at the start is that there is some perception that the SQE assessments are in some way easier than LPC assessments. That is not the case. They are at best different, but it shouldn't be seen as an easy route to qualification. So the SQE assessments, there are 2 new assessments. There's an SQE1 set of assessments and an SQE2 set of assessments. SQE1 tests something called functioning legal knowledge. SQE2 assesses skills, but it's also important to note here that one builds upon the other. So the skills that you're being assessed in for SQE2, you do still require your functioning legal knowledge as a sort of foundation stone on which to build those skills. So what is functioning legal knowledge? Functioning legal knowledge is the application of knowledge of the law to demonstrate the competencies required to the level of a newly qualified solicitor of England and Wales, and that's the SRA's definition. So it's a mixture of academic law knowledge in the 7 foundation subjects, contract and tort and so on, and vocational training knowledge in the practice areas of business, dispute resolution, property, wills, legal services, criminal practice, solicitors, accounts, and ethics. So straight away you can see, whereas there was a more of a distinction between the academic and vocational stages under the previous regime, here the SQE1 assessment is assessing academic and vocational knowledge. Now, the SQE1 assessment is quite chunky. The SQE1 assessment consists of 360 multiple choice questions of a particular type. So you may hear multiple choice question and think, well, that ought to be easy, but there are a lot of them. And it's also a particular type called single best answer questions. And the idea is that you get 5 options. And in theory, more than one of them could be correct, but one of them is the best. So it's a slightly different kettle of fish than answering just a normal multiple choice question. It requires a bit more analysis. And of course, you've got a lot of these questions. The assessments last for about 10 hours and 12 minutes, spread over 2 days with a break in the middle of each day. So it's quite a substantial undertaking in terms of doing these assessments. So as I say, you have to pick one of these options. More than one of them could in theory be correct. So it needs a little bit more analysis than you might be otherwise expecting from a multiple choice question. The SQE2 assessment is it's different because it's skills, but in some way it's even more demanding. It's about 14 hours of assessment, and you've got 16 separate assessments in advocacy and interviewing, case and matter analysis, legal writing, legal drafting, and legal research. And of course that sounds familiar from the LPC version of these assessments, in as much as you've got similar subjects, because of course you're aiming at the similar end point. But it's quite a chunky assessment, and that's over several days. So there are 12 SQE2 written assessments over several consecutive days, and on each of those days you sit several assessments. So the overall regime is quite a tough regime, but you can see there are similarities in terms of what you're trying to learn, because there are similarities in terms of, well, distinct similarity in terms of what you're trying to become, which is a solicitor. So some things have changed, some things have stayed the same. You shouldn't mistake one regime as being easier than the other, and in some sense, or some senses, this will depend on your learning style and your preferred methods of assessment. That may be a way of distinguishing between the two, should you have the option of choosing between the two. Which leads me onto another point, which is, so Jill, why should candidates still consider the LPC route into the profession, given that we have this brand new shiny SQE?
Thanks, Dan. That's a good question. I think the LPC will still be a valid qualification for a number of years. And whilst law firms and other legal employers continue to offer training contracts, which of course is the next stage required after completing an LPC, it remains a recognised way of entering the legal profession. The LPC is a very well-established course. It's been running for a number of years. And in addition to the core practice areas and skills, which are also assessed by the SQE regime, the LPC does contain additional content beyond the SQE syllabus, those elective subjects I was mentioning a moment ago, and that content is highly prized by legal employers. And I think that combination of factors will continue to make the LPC a popular choice with both students and their employers, whilst it remains an option to qualify as a solicitor. But I think the LPC will start to dwindle in terms of popularity in probably 2 to 3 years' time, as more candidates go into the SQE regime, and that becomes the norm. But certainly there will be a lot of students still choosing the LPC in 2023.
So what's the advice for students choosing between LPC courses? What should they be looking out for?
Yes, well, the LPC is a very heavily prescribed course, so the content will be pretty similar across the different training providers. So I think if I was choosing, the main factor that would help me decide where to study my LPC would be the location of the provider, where are the campuses, what are the course fees, are there any bursaries and scholarships that might be available, or are there any courses that would provide access to master's student loan funding. And of course, I think another key factor in choosing your provider is what is that law school's employability record, what are your employability outcomes going to be if you study with them.
So, as has been mentioned, we have this transition period going on. So what's the advice to students who are eligible to choose between the LPC and the SQE?
Yes, I think it's one of the toughest decisions for current students. And therefore, in a way, I would expect students to slightly push back and get a steer from their potential employers. So I think the main consideration for students when you're making this choice between the LPC and the SQE is whether or not you're expecting to be able to obtain a training contract, which is that 2-year period of recognised training following the LPC, or whether actually qualifying work experience, which is the 2 years training that you require under the SQE regime, is going to be a better option for you. So obviously for students who've already obtained a training contract, the LPC is going to be the most appropriate choice, of course, for you. So students who decide to sit the SQE assessments have to complete 2 years qualifying work experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about qualifying work experience in a moment. And I think, therefore, the key question they need to ask themselves is, will I be able to obtain qualifying work experience? Now, the good news about qualifying work experience compared with a training contract is that it is a lot more flexible. And it may well be the case that you have already obtained some form of legal employment which could count towards your qualifying work experience. So, for example, if you're currently working in a law clinic at your university, or doing at work in the vacations, that may well amount to qualifying work experience. So you're already beginning to build up your portfolio of work necessary to qualify under this route. So that may well make it an appropriate choice for you, because you may have already covered a significant amount of qualifying work experience before you even leave your university. Now, another factor I think that's really important to take into account when you're choosing between the two regimes is the difference in the assessments. Now, Dan's done a great job of explaining the SQE assessments. And I think what's really clear is that they are a significant set of assessments. And in particular, the skills assessments are more extensive than those skills assessments that you would be expected to sit on the LPC. With the SQE, you have 16 tasks. And also the style of assessment for SQE1, the large multiple choice question assessment papers, are very different from the traditional problem solving questions that you probably are already sitting at university level and which form the basis of the vast majority of assessments under the LPC, although you do have some MCQ exams. Excuse me. So fees are also important to consider. Students need to think about the differences in the course fees between the LPC itself and then the SQE preparation courses. And also a very important point to bear in mind is that if you go down the SQE route, there are additional assessment fees payable to the Solicitors Regulation Authority in order to sit those exams. So at the moment, SQE1 assessments, a fee is charged of £1,662. And for SQE2, that rises to £2,493. And these fees are likely to rise each year. So I think that's a really important consideration, to look at the costs of the courses, but also at the additional assessments. And I think it's also important to bear in mind these are centralised assessments, and there is a degree of complexity in terms of being able to register and book for these assessments, where the LPC assessments would normally be taken at your providers, and they are sort of set and run and managed by your LPC provider. And then I think the final factor that I would want to look at if I was making this decision is the difference in how long it takes to study both the LPC and for the SQE assessments. So typically the LPC lasts for 1 academic year. There are part-time options which are longer. And the SQE in principle can be studied over a shorter period of time. And that's partly due to the fact that there's no additional elective content in the SQE syllabus. So if you just want to get through SQE 1 and 2, it is a slightly more narrow syllabus than the current LPC. So those are the kind of the key factors that I would want to look at if I was making that decision. And I guess a really important factor that students would want to think about is the actual type of courses that they would need to take in order to get ready for the SQE. We've heard quite a lot about the LPC, but Dan, can you tell the listeners about the SQE courses that we're offering at the University of Law to prepare students for these SQE assessments, and also what additional content we have to get students ready for practice as junior lawyers?
Yes, indeed. Well, as you've heard so far, so the SQE is a bit of a different beast to the LPC, even though it's trying to get people to the same ultimate endpoint. Unlike the LPC, there are no requirements for a prescribed training program in order for you to sit the SQE. One important thing that people need to do early on, before taking any courses, to get an SQE account through the SRA's website. You need to remember that it's the SRA that are administering these assessments, so it's important to have this channel of communication with them by which you can do things like book assessments, ask for reasonable adjustments, and so on and so forth. So you register onto the SRA's portal and you enrol for the assessments and pay the assessment fees through that means. It would be possible just to do that and turn up and take the assessments without doing any sort of study beforehand. We don't think that many students are going to choose to do that because, as you'll have gathered, there is a lot of assessment and there's a lot of information that underpins that assessment. The SQE assessments are tough, and we think that students need to be very well prepared in order to stand the best chance of passing. So in terms of courses, there's a lot of choice we have at the university in terms of different types of course, different lengths of course. So we have standalone prep courses. We also have full master's courses. Now, fees have been mentioned, and one of the advantages of having a full master's course is that it can provide you with access to master's funding. So that is one aspect of the calculation that you or students will have to make. The other thing what we are able to do with master's courses is add a little bit of content. If you look carefully at the SQE syllabus and compare it to what was studied on the LPC, you may notice that things that may have been referred to as, say, LPC electives are missing. So what you have in the LPC with LPC electives is the opportunity to study certain subjects in a bit more depth, to look at particular areas of law. So what you have with the SQE is, in a sense, a little bit of a skills and knowledge gap where those electives are no longer contained. But what we can do with a master's course is offer something that we call SQE Plus at the university, where we give that opportunity back to actually study a variety of areas in a bit more depth, and also to look at the skills of being a lawyer more generally. So what we can offer is, in addition to these key practice areas that are giving you this additional depth and these areas of knowledge that are desirable to law firms, we're developing the well-rounded practitioner. And what we can give you is options to study what we call business of law, or a professional practice research report, just to flesh you out. So we're giving you additional knowledge and also fleshing out your skills as a practicing solicitor. So as I mentioned, there are different types of courses and different lengths that are available to suit different people's needs. We have part-time courses, we have full-time courses, online options, there is an attendance mode option. So there is a lot of accommodation to the different people's personal needs and learning needs as well. In terms of the SQE2 prep courses, obviously these have a basic requirement of imparting the 6 legal skills, and they also give an opportunity to take practice assessments and also receive feedback. I should also say something here about the ULaw SQE revision app. So this is our bespoke app. It's a portal that allows students to take a huge number of single best answer questions in preparation for the SQE1 assessment in particular, although it can be used as well as revision on SQE2. The revision app allows access to these questions in several ways. So there are weekly practice tests that are done after each of the units that are studied on the SQE1 to keep people on top of the subject matter they have just studied. The mock assessments on SQE1 are also taken, and it's also possible to take tests yourself of varying lengths. Something else I should mention about the app is that because it's collecting data, it actually allows us to do some prediction. So it's possible to have some predictive analytics going on in which we can actually see or start to make predictions as to how you might do in the real assessment if you carried on in the way that you currently are in relation to the course and indeed your single best answer questions. And it's quite a powerful tool. So having generated this data, we can then start extrapolating from it. And we're finding it to be really useful to actually help people understand where they are in the course and what indeed they might need to do to get ready for the real assessment. So I just wanted to add about the ULaw SQE revision app. We think it's a really powerful tool, particularly in relation to SQE1. So covered a lot of ground in terms of the content of LPC, content of SQE. Perhaps we should just turn to different types of student. So we've mentioned legal knowledge, academic law knowledge. So what about non-law students?
Thanks, Dan. That's a really good question, as I think there's a lot of confusion out there for non-law students. And one of the reasons for that is that, as you probably picked up from our earlier outline of the requirements necessary to qualify as a solicitor under the SQE regime, that the SRA no longer requires a law degree in order for you to qualify as a solicitor. Now, I think this point has led to a lot of confusion and misconceptions in the student body. And it remains technically true, you don't need a law degree, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that half the content of the SQE1 syllabus is made up of academic law. And academic law is the law that's traditionally studied on a law degree or a law conversion course. And we believe that some form of academic law training will be absolutely essential for non-law students to be ready for SQE1 and able to pass those assessments successfully. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that functioning legal knowledge, which Dan was outlining earlier, which contains both academic law content and practice area content, either sort of the vocational content, also forms part of the SQE2 assessments. So I think it's going to be really, really important for non-law students to still gain some form of academic law training. And I think another really relevant point for non-law students is thinking about your employment prospects. An acquisition of a solid understanding of academic law is really important to most law firms. And certainly from my interactions with law firms and other legal employers over the past couple of years while we've been discussing the SQE transition with them, is that they recognise the importance of this stage of legal training. And indeed, the vast majority of legal employers that we work with at the University of Law, who are still very keen to recruit non-law students, will be expecting them to have completed some form of academic law training. And indeed, many of those law firms are sponsoring their non-law students through equivalent law conversion courses that are similar to the old GDL, which is part of the LPC regime. So there are a variety of options at the University of Law to replace the old law conversion courses with new conversion courses for non-law students. And that will give those students the academic law content in a depth that is equivalent to students who've come straight from university with a law degree or an LLB. And we've got a range of conversion courses. But because they're no longer prescribed in the same way that the old graduate diploma in law was, we have been able to introduce some really good new content about developing skills, which is really important to legal employers, business organisations, which again is important to employers, and we've also introduced the use of the single best answer question, i.e. the type of questions that's used on your SQE1 assessments in our law conversion courses. So it's really getting you ready for SQE if that's the route that you're going to choose to qualify under. And indeed, the content of our academic law courses is very closely aligned to the academic law syllabus of the SQE assessments, so that you're covering the right areas of academic law to set you up properly for those assessments.
So drawing some of these strands together, we get an interesting additional question, which is about how law firms are actually approaching the recruitment process, because you have LPC students, you have SQE students. So will firms be recruiting a mixed cohort of LPC and SQE candidates, and how can candidates find out?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. And one of the things that we do at the University of Law is work with our law firms to kind of understand what's going on, and so we can advise our students about questions like this. So in terms of the larger employers, the larger law firms, they are planning to switch from one regime to the other in a very orderly manner. And the reason for that is so that their future trainees have equivalent training. They don't want particularly to have mixed cohorts. And from my interaction, the vast majority of the larger firms are planning to move to the SQE regime in 2023 with their first cohort of qualifying work experience trainees rather than LPC trainees starting in 2024. Now, some firms have already started. A very small handful moved to the SQE in September 22, so they'll be the first kind of QWE trainees starting. However, that's really the position for the large firms, and you can understand that when you've got a large number of trainees joining each year, you do need some sort of sense of order. However, large firms and indeed the majority of the rest of the firms recruiting do recognise that there will be students that will be qualifying under both routes for a few more years, and I think they're keeping a very open mind when it comes to recruiting. In essence, what firms want is to recruit the best talent, and therefore that will be the key driver rather than which qualification route you've actually taken. In terms of finding out what any particular employer that you're interested in joining is going to do, I think the best thing is to look at that firm's website, attend any law firm events that they may be running. A lot of them have very proactive graduate recruitment teams who go out and visit the universities and put on talks and presentations about what they're doing and what their training looks like. So I would urge you to go along and attend those presentations. And of course, always contact your own local careers service and see what they can advise you on this point. And of course, if you become a student at the University of Law, we have a very extensive careers service and we can provide that advice to you as well. Now, obviously, while we've got this transitional regime running, I think one of the questions that I've heard some students asking in the past, particularly if they've sort of chosen to do the LPC, but then they're worried that they will only get a job under the SQE regime. They want to know what the position is in terms of switching from one to the other. So Dan, can you actually switch from the LPC to the SQE?
Well, the bare answer is yes. Yes, it is possible. But as you would expect, because they are different courses, you may incur more fees. The main switch is coming from students who have already passed the LPC but have not secured a training contract. And those people may want to use the SQE route because it's got more flexibility than the LPC route on qualifying work experience. And the other thing to note is that as ex-LPC students or students who passed the LPC, they'll be exempt from taking SQE1. So there are a couple of considerations there. But obviously, if you're switching courses, then as with any provider, there may be fees involved. But there are some interesting points as to what you were exempted from having passed the LPC.
Great. And Dan, just another couple of questions that, again, are frequently asked by students when I'm talking about the LPC and the SQE. I just wondered what your thoughts were. First of all, will it take candidates longer to qualify using the SQE than the LPC? And I know you touched on this, but again, just to get your thoughts, is one route harder than the other?
They are interesting questions, and questions that obviously come up quite a lot from students. In terms of it taking longer to qualify with the SQE, not really. It's pretty similar in terms of length of time, although there are some differences in terms of what you can do and when. So the LPC is a prescribed course. It's prescribed by the SRA. It's typically one academic year if it's studied full time. The SQE could take less time if a student simply chose to do the short prep courses, so the SQE1 and SQE2 prep courses, and then take the assessments after each of those. But you have to also take into account the fact that the assessments, which are prescribed by the SRA and set by the SRA, are sat at different points in time over a year. And you can't progress onto taking the SQE2 assessment until you've passed the SQE1 assessment and have confirmed results. So in terms of whether one route is harder than the other, it is actually difficult to say at the moment because we have had a limited number of SQE1 and SQE2 real assessments come through the pipeline so far. But what we can say is that anyone who thinks that the SQE is definitely easier than the LPC, that probably not correct. They are tough sets of high-stakes assessments, as you would expect, because the SRA is trying to act as gatekeeper in terms of the profession. The best answer we can probably give is to do with the types of assessment and what your preference is. So they're very different in terms of the way they are assessed. We've mentioned that the LPC is a mixture of closed and open book knowledge-based assessments, whereas the SQE1 is single best answer questions, and the SQE2, you have this large number of skills assessments that's separated out. So it partly depends on your own learning preferences and learning style and preferred means of being assessed as to which, if you have the choice, you would choose. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that one is harder than the other, but they do have different features, and I think those are the things to take into account. Now, we've mentioned QWE, qualifying work experience, on a couple of occasions so far. So maybe this is the time to go into a bit more detail about it. So QWE, qualifying work experience, what is it and what are we doing about it at ULaw?
Yes, QWE is really important. And as we've outlined earlier on, it's one of the steps or stages that you have to go through in order to qualify as a solicitor under the SQE regime. And to complete your SQE, you are required to do 2 years of qualifying work experience. Now, what is qualifying work experience? Well, it's any experience of providing legal services that offers you the opportunity to develop some or all of the competencies needed to practice as a solicitor. I think it's worth making the point right at the outset that it's very different from the 2-year training contract, which is the 2-year period of work experience you need after doing the LPC. The training contract, the typical LPC training contract, was very heavily prescribed and involved you doing different seats in different practice areas and doing different types of work. With qualifying work experience, you could, in essence, do your experience in one particular practice area only, provided it gave you the opportunity to develop some or all of the competencies needed to practice as a solicitor. So in terms of what it looks like on the ground, the 2 years can be divided up between 4 different employers. So you can do 4 different placements. And these can also be completed at different points in time. So I think this, again, really differentiates it from the 2-year training contract under the LPC, in that it's got a much higher degree of flexibility. Now, qualifying work experience can be paid or it could be voluntary, and it could include working in a law clinic or as a paralegal, or a more formal qualifying work experience placement with a law firm akin to a training contract. And indeed, many employers are offering a formal 2-year period of qualifying work experience. But you can see from what I've outlined that there is a big range of options available to you, including that more traditional route of a 2-year training contract. But all of those different types of work experience will count as qualifying work experience. So we expect the vast majority of students to complete their qualifying work experience after passing SQE 1 and 2. I think that will be the kind of traditional route. But I think it is important to remember that you can acquire qualifying work experience whilst you're studying on your law degree or even on your non-law degree, and whilst you're studying for the SQE assessments on your preparation courses. And indeed, we have many part-time students studying for SQE who are working with legal employers and already beginning to build up their portfolio of qualifying work experience. And I think that is a very exciting development compared to the more formal training contract. So we expect the vast majority of students to complete their qualifying work experience after passing SQE 1 and SQE 2. Although I think it's really important to remember that you can acquire your qualifying work experience whilst you're studying on your law degree, and indeed while you're preparing for your SQE assessments. And that's a really new and exciting development compared to the traditional training contract under the LPC regime. Now, I should just mention that the University of Law is offering 4 weeks qualifying work experience to all of our students who choose to study on one of our master's programmes. And that qualifying work experience will be in our law clinic, where you'll be working with real lawyers and working on real cases and transactions. So I think that's a really exciting offer, and we're really delighted to be able to offer that to our future master's students. And that's everything I was going to say on qualifying work experience. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much for having us on the podcast. And of course, if anybody has any questions, please email the University of Law using the information on our website.